Welcome back to the Reading Room. My name is Josh Bearheart Hawk. I'm the author of the journal, Legends and Tales, Creepy and Fun Stories to Tell Around the Campfire, and the upcoming book, GPS Signal Lost. By the time you watch this, it might already be out. I don't know, but it is coming out April 26th. So you can check that out, as well as all my other books down in the links in the description below over on Amazon, or you can get a signed copy of any of my books over on my website, joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com. So this is, we're going to be reading chapter 4 of the journal. So this series is reading the journal chapter by chapter. Each video is going to be one chapter. For the most part, the first one was a couple of chapters, but it's going to be one chapter per video. Going through the story and talking a little bit about it. The last chapter was the first entry in the journal, which we found out that Heath Borgiers was the detective in 1964. And basically what I was trying to do with this book, and I went back and forth with the chapters a little bit. So we got basically a Heath chapter, and then something to do with Josh and him uncovering what's going on, and then another Heath chapter and a journal entry, or in this case, the journal entry and then the Heath chapter. So chapter 4 winds up being a Heath chapter, so we're going to dive in and learn a little bit more about Heath himself, so that we can see more of an outside perspective. And it was a little difficult to write some of this stuff. To write multiple perspectives in any book is difficult. And I'm probably going to talk a little bit about that on the main channel. If you want to go check that out, I'll probably have a video coming up about that. But let's go ahead and dive into chapter 4 here. Let me get over here. So chapter 4 is called No Rest for the Wicked, and this is a chapter covering a little bit about Heath. So the door to the bar opened up, letting sunlight shine into the otherwise dark space, and Heath walked in with a smile on his face. James, the bartender, looked up from his magazine, greeting his old friend with a smile while grabbing a glass to pour the man's regular drink. He knew that look. Heath had just completed a job and was celebrating the fact that he made it through another day. Heath sauntered up to the bar and sat down at his usual stool along the rounded end of the counter, 5 steps from the jukebox and 10 from the bathroom. The establishment rarely had any visitors, aside from a few regulars, and this day was no exception. One other patron was drinking today at a table in the back corner, and the only sound was that of the ceiling fan rotating above what used to be a dance floor. James filled a glass from one of the taps and slid it over to Heath. James had taken a part in his share of adventure when he was younger, somehow surviving into his 50s before pouring his life savings into the bar that he now spent almost all of his time in. It wasn't much to look at. The tile on the floor was peeling up in several places, and the wood paneling on the walls had seen better days, among the plethora of other issues. But it was the one thing in the world that he could say was his. He liked to tell the story to new patrons about the time that John F. Kennedy himself wandered in for a drink after a campaign event in nearby Mansfield during his presidential run in 1960. No one believed this, of course, but there was a stool near the middle of the counter with a plaque that claimed Kennedy sat here. Unsubstantiated claims of presidential candidates stopping by his side, the bar did have its share of history. In the 1920s, it was the place to be in the small town of Mount Vernon, with small-name celebrities from local plays drinking away their dreams of making it big on Broadway, and local music acts playing live nightly. The sale of alcohol was illegal back then, so measures had to be taken to hide the good stuff when the inevitable inspections would come up. When the Depression hit, the bar would become a makeshift food bank, helping locals get through the roughest times anyone had known. The Second Great War would see the bar regain its place as a beacon for those wishing to drink their cares away, with many having their final drink before shipping off and never making it back. Then, in 1946, the bar would be purchased by James Raven. James spent his youth longing for adventure, wanting to see the world and learn as much as he could about history and different cultures. In 1917, he would see his wish fulfilled in a way when the United States entered the Great War, and he joined the Navy. After 2 years, however, he would wind up having his left knee shattered by an unsecured anchor, and he would be unceremoniously discharged from the military. Still longing to see the world, James would join a company that sent expeditions all around the globe in search of artifacts for research and cataloging. On one of those expeditions in 1927, James would meet Margaret, the woman who would become his wife just 2 years later. Their marriage would be happy, although short-lived, as Margaret would fall ill and pass away in 1934. After losing the love of his life, James would spend the next couple of years volunteering for the most dangerous expeditions he could find, hoping each one would be his last. One trip to a dense jungle in Brazil would have finished him off if it hadn't been for the intervention of a naive young man by the name of Heath Bourgears. Heath would become an apprentice of sorts to James, giving him a reason to keep on living. The young man needed some direction in his life, as he had been drifting from place to place since he had lost his parents at only 13 years old, and James began to see Heath as a surrogate son. Things were going well until James took a bullet to the chest that missed his heart by mere inches, forcing him to slow down a bit and take the long, hard look in the mirror and reconsider his career choice. After discussing it with Heath, he decided the best thing to do would be to settle down and buy a bar. Moving back to his hometown, he found an old, run-down building that kind of reminded him of himself, and within a few months, he had built up a new local watering hole. Heath would continue hunting for artifacts, although he would stick to more local jobs. After a while, he became known as the man who can find anything, and clients would seek him out for their most difficult endeavors. Most of these jobs would be turned down due to travel requirements, but occasionally one would come around to pique Heath's interest and he would go a little further away. After each job, Heath would return to the bar to regale James of the story and wind down. The routine had become common for both men, and it brought a certain comfort and peace to their world. After a few sips in silence, Heath got up and walked over to the old jukebox. All of the music was out of date at this point, and none of it had ever really been popular, but that didn't stop him from dropping a dime and selecting his favorite track. As the song started playing, he walked back over and sat down, relaying the story of how he recovered the lucky limbs to James. Just as Heath was finishing the tale, the sound of the door opening startled both men. Their eyes darted over to see a dark figure walking in from the bright sunshine. As the door closed, the light from the bar revealed a young-looking woman standing in the entryway. She was wearing a gray dress with green trim, and her head was covered by a flowered bonnet. The flowers that adorned her hat appeared to have wilted, and she gave off an air of sadness as she stepped through the interior doorway into the main room. As she crossed the floor, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Reaching the bar, she climbed on a stool a few feet down the counter from where Heath and James were silently exchanging looks of concern. It was rare to have a new face in the old establishment, and even rarer for that face to be a woman, especially a young, pretty belle like this visitor. The silence in the room was unbearable for a moment, before finally being broken when James remembered he was a bartender. "Welcome to Margaret's. What can I get you?" James tried to sound as friendly as he could, but a slight waver in his voice betrayed his unease. "I'll just have a water if that's all right. I've been traveling all day and just need to rest for a few minutes." Her voice was much more ragged than either man expected, as though she had been screaming at the top of her lungs for hours and her vocal cords were about to give out. James grabbed a glass and walked over to the sink. He returned with the water. As he returned with the water, the woman's eyes locked onto his. She had the deepest blue eyes he had ever seen, almost like the sky itself was peering back at him. As he stared, her voice once again broke the silence. "I'm looking for a man who I'm told frequents this establishment. He can supposedly find anything, and I have something that I desperately need to find. Would you happen to know where I can find a man by the name of Heath Bourgears?" At the sound of his name being mentioned, Heath perked up. He had been trying to avoid looking at the woman, preferring to mind his own business for the time being, hoping she would get her drink and be gone so that he and James could pick back up their discussion. Something about this woman unsettled Heath, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Hearing her mention his name just made the feeling worse. It wasn't that he didn't want to help her, it was more that he needed a short vacation after the last couple of jobs, and he now had the money to take one. He stared at his beer and pretended he hadn't heard her, hoping James would be able to get her to leave and maybe return another day, after he had a chance to rest. He does come here from time to time, but only on his off hours. He has an office downtown. You can leave a message with his assistant. James was trying to avoid looking at Heath, knowing he preferred to keep business separate from drinking. I was already at his office and I explained my circumstances to Miss Samantha, but she refused to hear me out and said Mr. Bourgears would not accept my case. I know if I could just speak to him, he seems like the kind of man who would be willing to help someone in my position. The woman was almost on the verge of tears, pleading with her eyes for any help James could give. In a moment of weakness, he glanced down the bar at Heath. Matching his gaze, the woman put together the most obvious clue that James could have provided and turned her attention to Heath. Mr. Bourgears? Heath Bourgears? I've been looking for you for weeks. I desperately need your help to find my daughter. At the mention of a missing person, Heath raised his eyes to meet hers. He could see that she was hurting, but this was way outside his realm. A missing artifact, sure, but a person? Ma'am, I understand you must be in a lot of pain, but I can't help you. This sounds like something you need the proper authorities for. Have you gone to the police? Somehow he already knew the answer. The police have been no use at all. They said she probably ran off with some boy, and that isn't something she would do. I've exhausted every possible option, spent months looking all over, and finally heard about you. They say you can find anything, that you have a nose for it. Please, you have to help me. Heath looked over at James, who was looking back with an apologetic smile. As he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, he heard the unexpected sound of James's voice. We'll take the job. There's the end of chapter 4. we get a little bit interesting here. So this is where we kind of jump off and we start to get into what's going to be happening with the story. And the entirety of the story is basically what happened to Heath Bourgears in 1964, and we're going to be finding more about that in later chapters. But next week, or the next video, is going to be chapter 5. I'll put that up here at the end of the video, as well as the link to the playlist. If you want to, if for some reason you started with chapter 4 and you made it all the way through, cool. But you should probably go back and listen to the first few chapters, because that's going to be where you're going to really pick up the story. So I want to thank you all for watching. We'll shout out the Patreon real quick. I've been trying to remember to do that in the end of the videos here. You can go over and join the Patreon. You can get early access to videos, get your name in videos, story about some of the upcoming news and stuff like that before anybody else about the books and stuff that I've got coming out, as well as things like free copies of signed books and all that kind of stuff. So go check that out if that's something you're interested in. Otherwise, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, all the normal YouTuber stuff. Well, thank you all for watching. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.